My name is Brigitte Taylor, 34 years old, and until last month, I was just another overlooked strategy executive at TechForge. 10 years of building acquisition plans only to have my assistant Maxwell take credit and mock me in front of our board. Too bad none of your ideas made the strategic plan, he said with that smirk. The CEO laughed. What happened next would sink a $225 million deal and change both our careers forever. If you're watching this, drop a comment letting me know where you're viewing from. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I turned the tables on corporate betrayal. I always believed that hard work and integrity would eventually win out in the cutthroat world of tech strategy. After graduating from Harvard Business School with honors, I spent the next decade climbing from financial analyst to senior strategy executive at TechForge, a mid-sized technology company with big ambitions. We specialized in enterprise software solutions, competing against giants with $100 billion market caps, while trying to carve out our niche through innovation and strategic acquisitions. TechForge had grown steadily under the leadership of our CEO Thomas Reynolds, a charismatic 45-year-old visionary with a talent for exciting investors, but sometimes prioritizing speed over diligence. Move fast and fix problems later was practically his motto, which often clashed with my more methodical approach to business development. Brigitte is our voice of reason, Thomas would say. In management meetings, though I often suspected it wasn't entirely a compliment, she never lets us make a move without triple-checking every detail. My reputation for thoroughness had saved the company millions over the years by identifying problematic acquisitions before we pulled the trigger. I'd stopped us from purchasing a software firm with significant unresolved patent litigation and identified accounting irregularities at another target that later faced SEC investigation. These wins earned me respect, if not always appreciation, for slowing down the process. 18 months ago, Thomas hired Maxwell Reed as my executive assistant. Maxwell was 29, fresh from Yale, with an MBA and connections throughout the tech industry. He was brilliant, I'll give him that. Quick with financial models and skilled at synthesizing complex information into compelling presentations. Maxwell will help you scale your impact, Thomas told me. With your eye for risk and his speed, you'll be unstoppable. What Thomas failed to mention was Maxwell's ambition and complete lack of scruples. The warning signs appeared within weeks. During his first strategy meeting, Maxwell presented my analysis of potential acquisition targets as though the work had been his own. I've identified 3 promising candidates in the customer experience space, he announced to the room, flipping through slides I'd prepared and given him for final formatting. I spoke up immediately. Those are the targets from my assessment last month. I'm glad Maxwell found them useful for his onboarding. The room fell uncomfortable silent. Maxwell recovered smoothly. Absolutely. Brigitte laid excellent groundwork. I've just added some additional valuation metrics and growth projections. He had indeed added 2 slides with flashy graphics that looked impressive but added little substance. Thomas, however, was impressed. This is exactly why we brought you on, Maxwell, taking good work and making it exceptional. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. Maxwell would take my thorough analyses, repackage them with slick visuals, and present them directly to Thomas or other executives. He began speaking over me, in meetings interrupting with phrases like, "What Brigitte is trying to say is," before completely altering my point. Despite this behavior, I tried to mentor him. "Maxwell, we need to work as a team. I value your contributions, but undermining colleagues isn't how successful executives operate long-term." He nodded with feigned sincerity. "You're absolutely right. I get carried away with enthusiasm sometimes. I deeply respect your experience." 2 days later, I overheard him telling a colleague from marketing that I was old school and afraid of innovation. I should have taken stronger action then, but instead I focused on proving my value through results. Everything changed when Thomas announced our interest in acquiring Nexus Software, a promising startup with a valuation of $225 million. Nexus had developed what they claimed was groundbreaking AI technology for predictive analytics in supply chain management. Exactly the kind of capability TechForge needed to compete with larger rivals. This acquisition could transform our market position, Thomas declared, during the executive meeting, where he introduced the opportunity. Their technology is years ahead of competitors, and their client list includes Fortune 50 companies. I noticed Maxwell straighten in his chair, an unusual gleam of excitement in his eyes. When Thomas assigned him to support me in the due diligence process, Maxwell's enthusiasm seemed excessive, even for such a significant opportunity. We'll need to move quickly, Thomas emphasized. 3 other potential buyers are circling, and we have a narrow window to close this deal before the price goes up. I nodded cautiously. We'll be thorough but efficient. The size of this acquisition requires extra care. Just don't let perfect be the enemy of good, Thomas replied with a pointed look. This is a transformative opportunity we can't afford to lose. As the meeting dispersed, Maxwell lingered by Thomas's side, engaging him in conversation. I couldn't hear what they discussed, but their animated expressions and occasional glances in my direction left me uneasy. Something about this acquisition felt wrong from the start, but I couldn't yet pinpoint why. Later that day, Maxwell stopped by my office with the preliminary documents on Nexus software. I can take point on the financial models if you'd like to focus on the strategic fit, he offered a little too eagerly. That's thoughtful, but I'll need to review all aspects personally, I replied. $225 million is our largest potential acquisition to date. His smile tightened. Of course. Just trying to be efficient. As Maxwell left my office, I couldn't shake the feeling that this acquisition would test more than just our company's growth strategy. It would test my career survival instincts as well. The due diligence process for the Nexus acquisition began immediately. Thomas established an aggressive 8-week timeline to complete our assessment and present recommendations to the board. I assembled a team of analysts from finance, legal, and technology departments to examine different aspects of Nexus's business. Maxwell will coordinate the work streams and report directly to me. I informed the team during our kickoff meeting. All findings should be documented thoroughly and shared with the entire group. Maxwell nodded enthusiastically, but wasted no time establishing his own communication channels. By the end of the first week, I noticed he had scheduled separate meetings with Thomas that weren't on my calendar. When I asked about them, he described them as quick alignment check-ins to keep the CEO updated. Thomas wants frequent updates on our progress, Maxwell explained. These are just informal touchpoints to keep him in the loop. Nothing substantive. I might have believed him if Catherine, one of our financial analysts, hadn't mentioned that Maxwell presented preliminary valuation models to Thomas without my review. He showed some interesting scenarios for post-acquisition integration, Catherine said. I thought you'd approved them. I maintained my composure. I haven't seen those models yet. Please make sure all materials pass through me before they're shared more broadly. Catherine looked uncomfortable. Sorry, I assumed. Maxwell said you were focusing on the big picture and delegated the financial details to him. This pattern continued and intensified. Maxwell began positioning himself as the de facto lead on the acquisition. During the 3rd week of due diligence, I received a calendar invitation for a meeting with Nexus executives, scheduled during my daughter's school presentation, which had been on my calendar for months. Maxwell was listed as the meeting organizer. I confronted him immediately. Why was this critical meeting scheduled when I'm unavailable? Maxwell appeared genuinely surprised. Oh, that's when the Nexus team said they could meet. Thomas thought we shouldn't delay since the timeline is tight. I assumed you'd reschedule your personal commitment. This isn't how we operate, Maxwell. Coordinating our team means working with everyone's schedule, especially for key meetings. He nodded contritely. You're absolutely right. My mistake. Should I try to reschedule with Nexus? No, I'll adjust my personal plans, I replied, knowing that Maxwell had deliberately put me in an impossible position. But going forward, consult me before confirming key meetings. I canceled my attendance at my daughter's presentation, something I still regret. Maxwell attended the meeting with Nexus, alongside Thomas, and I received only a cursory summary afterward. As the due diligence progressed, I began noticing inconsistencies in Nexus's financial reports. Their claimed revenue growth of 70% year over year seemed impressive, but the customer contracts I reviewed didn't support those numbers. Several major clients listed in their marketing materials had signed only preliminary agreements rather than full contracts. I raised these concerns during our team meeting. We need to reconcile these discrepancies before proceeding. The revenue projections seem inflated based on actual signed contracts. Maxwell immediately pushed back. These are standard practices for high-growth startups. They include committed, but not yet signed deals in their projections. All the major analysts covering this space use similar methodologies. Standard practice doesn't make it accurate, I countered. Our valuation needs to be based on actual results and signed contracts. Thomas, who had unexpectedly joined our meeting, sided with Maxwell. Brigitte, this is why we sometimes struggle to close deals. You're applying established company metrics to a disruptive startup. I stood my ground. Due diligence exists precisely to verify claims before we spend millions of stockholder dollars. Thomas sighed. Continue your verification, but don't lose sight of the strategic value here. The technology alone justifies the premium. After the meeting, I noticed Maxwell increasingly excluding me from key discussions. Meetings with Nexus technical teams were scheduled without my knowledge. Documents arrived in my inbox hours before decisions needed to be made, giving me insufficient time for review. When I requested access to their source code for our technical team to evaluate, Maxwell informed me that Thomas had agreed to a more streamlined technical assessment. We've signed an updated NDA that limits our access to certain proprietary elements, Maxwell explained. Thomas felt we were being too invasive and risking the deal. My suspicions grew when I overheard Maxwell in the break room, telling colleagues that I was past my prime and too risk-averse for today's tech landscape. Brigitte's brilliant, but she's from a different era, he told Amanda, from legal. She doesn't understand how modern tech acquisitions work. Despite these obstacles, I continued my meticulous research. Working late one evening, I discovered that Nexus had been involved in a previously undisclosed patent dispute with a competitor named Vertex Systems. The case had been settled confidentially, but court records indicated it involved core elements of their AI technology. Further investigation revealed potentially serious problems with Nexus's intellectual property claims. Their groundbreaking AI algorithms bore striking similarities to research published by a university laboratory 2 years earlier. Yet their patent applications made no reference to this prior art. I documented these findings carefully and attempted to discuss them with Maxwell the next morning. We need to conduct a deeper IP review before proceeding, I insisted. There are serious questions about the originality of their technology. Maxwell dismissed my concerns. Those similarities are coincidental. Their engineering team developed their algorithms independently. Thomas has already discussed this with their CTO. When did that discussion happen, I asked. Last week. He's satisfied with their explanation. I was being systematically sidelined from the very process I was supposed to lead. That afternoon, I requested a private meeting with Thomas to share my concerns directly. Maxwell says you're fixating on theoretical risks, instead of the opportunity, Thomas said before I could even present my findings. We can't afford analysis paralysis on this deal. It's not theoretical if their core technology infringes on existing IP, I replied. We could be buying ourselves a lawsuit and worthless technology. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Brigitte, I've always valued your caution, but sometimes your perfectionism gets in the way of progress. Every acquisition has risks. Our job is to manage them, not avoid them entirely. I realized then that Maxwell had been poisoning my relationship with Thomas for weeks, positioning himself as the forward-thinking executor and me as the obstacle to progress. As I left Thomas's office, the weight of what was happening became clear. I was being pushed out of a process I should be leading, and a potentially disastrous acquisition was moving forward without proper scrutiny. That night I stayed until 11, combing through every document we had on Nexus. My concerns weren't just valid, They were potentially company saving. But would anyone listen before it was too late? 5 weeks into the due diligence process, Maxwell scheduled a company-wide presentation to share the strategic plan for the Nexus acquisition. I was stunned to receive the invitation. As head of strategy, I should have been developing this plan, not learning about it alongside everyone else. I immediately called Maxwell. Why am I just hearing about this strategic plan presentation now? Oh, Thomas asked me to pull it together last week, Maxwell replied casually. He wanted a fresh perspective, and since you've been focused on the risk assessment, I took the initiative on the integration strategy. That's literally my job description, Maxwell. I know, but Thomas thought. Well, maybe you should talk to him directly. When I confronted Thomas, he was dismissive. Brigitte, you've been raising red flags at every turn. We needed someone to focus on how this acquisition will work, not just why it might fail. My concerns are substantive, I insisted. The technology may not be what they claim. Maxwell reviewed their tech with our CTO, and they're confident. Your risk assessment will be incorporated in the final recommendation, but we need to keep moving forward. The presentation was scheduled for the following day, giving me no time to properly review the materials or prepare a response. As I sat in the conference room, alongside 50 colleagues from across the company, Maxwell took the stage with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Today, I'm excited to share our strategic vision for integrating Nexus software, he began, standing beside Thomas. This acquisition represents the future of TechForge and will accelerate our growth trajectory significantly. For the next 40 minutes, Maxwell presented a comprehensive plan covering everything from technical integration to market positioning. The slides were polished, the financial projections ambitious. He had clearly been working on this for weeks, all while I was being fed the narrative that no decisions had been made. By combining Nexus's predictive AI with our existing platform, Maxwell continued, we project revenue synergies of $70 million in the first year alone. When he opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand. These projections assume the technology performs as advertised and that there are no intellectual property issues. Our technical and legal review isn't complete yet. Maxwell smiled thinly. We've conducted sufficient technical validation to be confident in these projections. The remaining due diligence is just crossing T's and dotting I's. Several colleagues glanced uncomfortably in my direction. They knew this acquisition fell under my purview, yet Maxwell was clearly positioning himself as the authority. After the meeting, Thomas pulled me aside. Maxwell knocked that out of the park. Didn't he? The executive team is fully on board now. Thomas, we're rushing this deal without adequate scrutiny, I warned. There are serious red flags about their technology and financials. He sighed. Brigitte, sometimes you need to trust your team. Maxwell has done exceptional work here. He's not doing due diligence. He's selling a narrative. Well, it's a compelling narrative that our board and investors will appreciate. The final presentation to the board is in 3 weeks. I want you both there, but we're proceeding with this acquisition. That evening, I received an email that had been accidentally forwarded to me, a conversation between Maxwell and Thomas discussing board preparation that I should have been included in from the start. As I scrolled through the email chain, a particular exchange caught my attention. From Maxwell to Thomas. Regarding the IP concerns Brigitte raised, I've spoken with Nexus's legal team. They acknowledge the similarities with the university research, but insist their implementation is sufficiently different. They've agreed to add specific indemnification language to cover any potential claims. Thomas's reply. Good enough for me. No need to dig further on this unless Brigitte finds something concrete. The deal timeline is the priority now. I sat back stunned. Maxwell was aware of the IP issues, but had deliberately downplayed them. Worse, he had discussed them with Thomas behind my back, positioning the concern as minor when it could potentially invalidate the entire value proposition of the acquisition. The next morning, I contacted Amanda Thompson in our legal department, someone I had worked with for years and trusted implicitly. Amanda, I need your confidential assessment of something I said. closing my office door. There are IP concerns with the Nexus acquisition that I don't believe are being properly addressed. Amanda reviewed the materials I'd gathered, her expression growing increasingly troubled. This is serious, Brigitte. These algorithms appear substantially similar to the published research. If Nexus didn't properly license or develop this independently, with significant modifications, we could be looking at major infringement issues. That's what I thought. But Maxwell has convinced Thomas it's a minor concern that can be addressed with indemnification language. Indemnification only works if the company has the assets to back it up, Amanda pointed out. If Nexus's core technology is compromised, their entire valuation collapses. No indemnification clause would adequately protect us. What would you recommend? Amanda thought carefully. You need independent technical verification from experts who haven't been influenced by Maxwell or the deal momentum. And you need to understand why this is being pushed through despite these concerns. I faced an ethical dilemma. Speaking up more forcefully could cost me my job if Thomas had already committed emotionally and professionally to the deal. Staying silent could mean watching the company make a catastrophic $225 million mistake. That night I began researching more thoroughly, starting with Nexus's founding team. Their CEO had impressive credentials, but as I dug into their chief technology officer's background, I discovered something disturbing. Ryan Fletcher, Nexus's CTO, had previously worked at a small AI startup called Algor Systems, where Maxwell had been a product manager 3 years earlier. This connection wasn't mentioned in any of our due diligence materials. Further investigation revealed that Maxwell and Fletcher had co-authored a paper on machine learning during their time at Algor. Maxwell had deliberately concealed a prior professional relationship with a key executive at our acquisition target. The next morning, I discreetly asked our HR director for access to Maxwell's employment application and background check, claiming I needed it for the due diligence file. His resume listed the position at Algor Systems, but made no mention of working with anyone now at Nexus. I continued digging through public records and discovered something even more troubling. Maxwell owned stock options in a holding company that appeared in Nexus's cap table. If this acquisition went through, Maxwell stood to personally profit beyond his role at TechForge. Working late into the night, I prepared a comprehensive dossier documenting everything the intellectual property concerns, the undisclosed relationships, the financial discrepancies, and Maxwell's potential conflict of interest. I included technical assessments, legal opinions from Amanda, and evidence of how Maxwell had systematically excluded me from critical parts of the process. As I finished compiling the documents at 2 a.m, I realized the board meeting was just 2 days away. Maxwell had scheduled the final prep session without including me. I would have only one chance to prevent a disaster, and it would require perfect timing and irrefutable evidence. I made 3 copies of my dossier. 1 stayed with me, 1 went into Amanda's safekeeping, and the 3rd I prepared in a simple blue folder, labeled Nexus Acquisition Critical Risk Assessment. The betrayal was no longer just professional, it had potentially crossed into unethical conduct that could damage the company I had helped build for a decade. I went home that night knowing that the next 48 hours would likely determine both the company's future and my career. The day of the board meeting arrived with a palpable tension in TechForge's executive floor. The company had spared no expense in preparation, transforming our largest conference room into an impressive presentation space. Digital displays showed Nexus's logo alongside our own, creating a visual impression that the deal was already completed. I arrived an hour early, dressed in my most professional navy suit, my dossier, secure in my leather portfolio. The reception area outside the boardroom was already buzzing with activity as staff arranged refreshments and technical support checked the presentation systems. Maxwell arrived 40 minutes before the scheduled start, looking confident in an expensive new suit. He nodded curtly in my direction before joining Thomas, who was reviewing notes at the far end of the room. "Morning, Brigitte," Thomas said as I approached. "All set for today?" "Absolutely," I replied calmly. "I've prepared thoroughly for this discussion." Maxwell interjected quickly. "Thomas and I ran through the final presentation until midnight. It's bulletproof. I'm sure the board will have questions beyond the slides I noted." Thomas patted Maxwell's shoulder. That's why we have this guy. He knows this deal inside and out. Board members began arriving 15 minutes before the scheduled start. I made a point of personally greeting each one, especially Eleanor Phillips, our lead investor. Eleanor was a veteran of technology investments with a reputation for incisive questions and zero tolerance for inadequate preparation. Brigitte, good to see you, Eleanor said warmly. I've been reading about predictive AI applications. Fascinating space. It is indeed, I agreed. There's a lot to consider with this acquisition. Maxwell smoothly inserted himself into our conversation. Eleanor, I'd be happy to walk you through our technical assessment before we start. Eleanor looked between us, sensing the tension. Let's save it for the formal presentation, shall we? At precisely 10 o'clock, all 12 board members were seated around the polished conference table. Thomas opened the meeting with his customary enthusiasm. Today represents a pivotal moment for TechForge, he began. The acquisition of Nexus Software will position us as leaders in AI-driven enterprise solutions. Maxwell Reed has led our strategic assessment and will present our findings and recommendations. I noticed several board members glance in my direction, clearly surprised that the company's senior strategy executive wasn't leading this presentation. I maintained a neutral expression as Maxwell took center stage. For the next 40 minutes, Maxwell delivered a polished presentation outlining Nexus's technology market position and the projected financial benefits of the acquisition. His slides were impeccable, his delivery confident. He positioned the $225 million price tag as a bargain given the projected revenue synergies. In conclusion, Maxwell said this acquisition represents the transformative opportunity TechForge has been seeking. We recommend proceeding to final contract negotiations immediately to secure this asset before competitors recognize its value. Thomas nodded approvingly. Questions from the board? Eleanor spoke first. I'd like to hear from Brigitte on the due diligence findings. As our head of strategy, what's your assessment? Before I could respond, Maxwell interjected, I can address the due diligence questions. Brigitte was involved in early stages, but I've overseen the comprehensive process. I started to speak, but Maxwell continued. We've identified standard integration challenges, but nothing that impacts our valuation thesis. Eleanor persisted. Brigitte, your thoughts? As I prepared to answer, Maxwell delivered the blow he'd clearly been waiting to inflict. Actually, he said with a slight smirk, Brigitte had some initial concerns, but they didn't materially impact our strategic plan. Too bad none of your ideas made the final strategic plan. Right, Brigitte? The room fell silent. Thomas chuckled awkwardly, attempting to diffuse the tension, but only making it worse. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I felt a momentary wave of shock at the blatant disrespect, followed by an unexpected calm. Months of frustration crystallized into perfect clarity. This wasn't just about me or Maxwell anymore. It was about corporate governance and $225 million of shareholder money about to be wasted. I smiled, stood up slowly, and walked around the table to where Eleanor was seated. Without a word, I opened my portfolio and removed the blue folder I had prepared. I placed it directly in front of her. What's this? Eleanor asked. Information critical to your fiduciary duties regarding this acquisition. I replied clearly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear. I recommend you start with the executive summary on page 1. Maxwell's confident expression faltered. We haven't reviewed whatever this is. This isn't the appropriate forum for last-minute materials. Eleanor held up her hand to silence him and opened the folder. Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern to alarm as she read the first page. After a long moment, she looked up at Thomas, her voice deadly serious. Call your lawyer. Now. Thomas blanched. What? Why? Eleanor turned to the other board members. I move that we immediately enter executive session. All management except Brigitte should leave the room, and we need our general counsel here immediately. The board's lead director quickly seconded the motion. Thomas looked bewildered, while Maxwell's face had drained of color. This is completely inappropriate, Maxwell protested. You can't make decisions based on unvetted information deliberately withheld from the management team. Eleanor fixed him with a steely gaze. Mr. Reed, the board will determine what's appropriate. Please leave the room immediately. As Maxwell and Thomas exited, followed by other executives, I remained standing beside Eleanor. The room hummed with tense murmurs as board members passed around the first page of my dossier. Brigitte, Eleanor said quietly, you realize the seriousness of what you've presented. I do, I answered. That's precisely why I brought it directly to the board. The integrity of our acquisition process has been compromised. The company's general counsel, Robert Jennings, arrived within minutes looking concerned. Eleanor handed him the folder. Robert, we need your immediate assessment of this information. For the next 2 hours, I presented my findings to the board. I walked them through the intellectual property concerns, showing how Nexus's core technology appeared to be derived from university research without proper attribution or licensing. Their patents likely wouldn't withstand challenge, I explained. The similarities are too substantial to be coincidental. I then revealed Maxwell's undisclosed prior relationship with Nexus's CTO and his financial interest in the transaction. Maxwell owned options in this holding company, I said, pointing to the relevant documents, which would be converted to cash in this acquisition. He has a personal financial stake he never disclosed. Robert confirmed the severity of the issues. If accurate, these represent material concerns that should have been disclosed during due diligence. The IP issues alone could invalidate much of Nexus's claimed value. Eleanor turned to me. Why didn't you bring these concerns through normal channels? I attempted to, I replied. As documented on pages 20 through 25, my concerns were repeatedly dismissed or sidelined. Maxwell controlled information flow to Thomas and presented an incomplete picture to management. The board members exchanged troubled glances. Eleanor finally spoke for the group. We need to suspend this acquisition process immediately pending an independent investigation. Robert, please inform Thomas and prepare for potential legal action against Nexus for material misrepresentation. As the executive session concluded, the board asked me to wait outside while they deliberated next steps. Through the glass walls, I could see Maxwell arguing animatedly with Thomas in a nearby office. When Thomas noticed me standing in the hallway, his expression was a mix of anger and confusion. After 30 minutes, Eleanor emerged from the boardroom. Brigitte, the board would like you to join us again. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The lead director addressed me directly. Brigitte, we want to thank you for your courage in bringing these matters to our attention. We've unanimously voted to halt the Nexus acquisition process and launch an independent investigation into both the company and the internal processes that failed here. Eleanor added, we've also asked Thomas to place Maxwell on administrative leave, pending investigation of his potential conflict of interest. As I left the boardroom, I saw security personnel approaching Maxwell's office. The acquisition that had seemed inevitable just hours ago had collapsed, and with it, Maxwell's carefully constructed deception. Thomas caught up with me in the corridor, his earlier confidence replaced with grave concern. Is it really this bad? Could we have been this wrong? Yes, I said simply, but we caught it before signing the deal. Why didn't you come to me directly? He demanded. I met his gaze steadily. I tried Thomas, multiple times, but Maxwell had convinced you not to listen. As security escorted Maxwell from the building, his final glare in my direction contained pure hatred. But I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that a potentially disastrous acquisition had been prevented. The board meeting that was supposed to approve a $225 million acquisition had instead exposed a fundamental breakdown in corporate governance. As I returned to my office, I knew the coming weeks would bring intense scrutiny and difficult conversations. But for the first time in months, I could breathe, knowing that integrity had prevailed. The 48 hours following the board meeting were a whirlwind of activity. TechForge's general counsel Robert Jennings assembled a crisis management team, including outside legal counsel, specialized in securities law and corporate governance. The executive floor buzzed with urgent meetings as the company scrambled to understand the full implications of what had transpired. I spent most of that time in conference rooms, repeating my findings to increasingly larger groups of lawyers and executives. With Maxwell gone, information that had been compartmentalized began flowing more freely, and others started corroborating parts of my assessment. Catherine from the finance team approached me privately. "Brigitte, I need to tell you something. Maxwell asked me to exclude certain data points from the financial models because they were outliers that would confuse the narrative. When I pushed back, he said it came from Thomas directly." "Did you document this request?" I asked. "Yes, I kept the original models and his emails. I should have told you sooner, but he implied my job would be at risk." Similar conversations occurred with other team members who had been pressured or misled by Maxwell. The picture that emerged was disturbing: a systematic campaign to control information and drive the acquisition forward, despite clear warning signs. On the second day, Thomas finally requested a private meeting with me. When I entered his office, he looked like he had aged years in 48 hours. "The board is furious," he said without preamble. "Eleanor has called for an emergency governance review. This is a mess, Brigitte." "It could have been much worse if the deal had gone through," I pointed out. Thomas ran his hands through his hair. "Did you know Maxwell was having private dinners with Nexus executives dating back 6 months before we officially engaged with them?" I suspected something, but I didn't have proof of that specific connection. He brought them to me as a new discovery he had made through industry contacts. Thomas looked genuinely distressed. "I feel like an idiot." "He was skilled at manipulation," I said, offering a small measure of grace. "And he told you what you wanted to hear, about a transformative opportunity." "That's no excuse. I should have listened to your concerns." Thomas straightened in his chair. "The board has asked me to place you temporarily in charge of strategic operations while the investigation proceeds." I raised an eyebrow. "How do you feel about that?" "Honestly relieved. You were right, and you saved us from a disaster of my making. I need to rebuild trust with the board, and having you step up helps demonstrate that we're correcting course." The next morning, Robert Jennings called me to his office, where he was meeting with Diane Winters, a partner from our outside counsel. "We've conducted preliminary interviews with Nexus executives," Diane explained. "Their story is falling apart. They're claiming they were forthright with Maxwell, and that he understood the limitations of their technology." "Are they acknowledging the IP issues?" I asked. "Not explicitly, but their answers about the development timeline are inconsistent. We believe they're preparing to claim that Maxwell misrepresented their disclosures to TechForge." Robert added, "The board has authorized us to refer this matter to the SEC if we find evidence of securities fraud. This could get very ugly." "What about Maxwell's financial interest?" "Confirmed," Diane said grimly. "He owned options through an LLC registered in his brother-in-law's name. He would have made approximately $3.2 million personally from this deal." The news spread quickly throughout the company despite efforts to manage communications. By the end of the week, TechForge's stock had dropped 7% as analysts speculated about governance problems. Competitors began circling, sensing weakness and opportunity. I called an all-hands meeting to address the mounting anxiety among employees. "I know there are rumors and concerns," I began, facing hundreds of worried faces. "I want to be as transparent as possible while respecting the ongoing investigation. Yes, we discovered serious issues with the Nexus acquisition that caused us to halt the process. Yes, this revealed procedural failures that we're addressing. But no, this does not threaten TechForge's core business or future." The questions came rapid fire. Will there be layoffs? Is the CEO resigning? Are we still looking for acquisitions? I answered as honestly as I could. Our fundamentals remain strong. We're pausing major M&A activity while we strengthen our processes, but this experience will ultimately make us a stronger company. Not everyone was supportive. Maxwell had cultivated allies throughout the organization, who viewed me as the villain who derailed an exciting opportunity. Anonymous messages appeared on the company's internal forum, questioning my motives, and accusing me of sabotaging the deal out of jealousy. Thomas called me into his office after receiving the preliminary investigation report from outside counsel. "It's worse than we thought," he said, pushing a document across his desk. Nexus knew their technology infringed on the university research. They had received a cease and desist letter 6 months ago, but didn't disclose it. I reviewed the findings, and Maxwell knew about this. The investigators found emails between him and their CTO discussing how to position the IP situation to make it digestible for our legal team. Thomas looked physically ill. They were deliberately concealing material information. What happens now? The board has called an emergency session for tomorrow. Eleanor wants both of us there. The board meeting was tense but surprisingly constructive. Eleanor opened by acknowledging the governance failures while commending the eventual correction. "This could have been catastrophic," she stated bluntly. "A $225 million acquisition of compromised technology would have destroyed shareholder value and potentially resulted in years of litigation." The board had 4 immediate directives. First, TechForge would file a formal complaint with the SEC regarding Nexus's material misrepresentations. Second, the company would implement enhanced due diligence protocols with mandatory independent verification of technology claims. Third, all executives involved in M&A would be required to disclose any pre-existing relationships with potential acquisition targets. Fourth, the board would form a special committee to review all major decisions made during Maxwell's tenure to ensure no other issues existed. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor asked me to stay behind. "Brigitte, the board recognizes that your integrity saved this company from a significant mistake. We're discussing appropriate recognition of your contribution, but in the meantime we need you to help rebuild confidence both internally and with our investors." Over the following weeks, the fallout continued to spread. The SEC opened a formal investigation into Nexus. 2 of their executives resigned. Industry publications ran stories with headlines like "TechForge dodges $225 million, bullet and due diligence, heroin saves tech firm from acquisition disaster." Maxwell hired an aggressive attorney and threatened to sue for wrongful termination, claiming he was being scapegoated for management failures. His attorney approached me directly, suggesting that a joint narrative blaming Nexus entirely would benefit everyone. "Your client committed a serious ethics violation," I informed the attorney. "The evidence is overwhelming. I suggest he cooperate with investigators if he wants to salvage any part of his career." The threat of legal action evaporated shortly after the SEC investigators interviewed Maxwell. Throughout this period, running day-to-day strategy operations while managing the crisis response stretched me to my limits. I worked 16-hour days, reassuring clients, supporting the investigation, and trying to rebuild the team's morale. The most difficult conversations were with Thomas, who alternated between gratitude for my intervention and resentment over the damage to his reputation. In quieter moments, he acknowledged his responsibility. "I wanted that acquisition to be the capstone of my time," as CEO he admitted during a late evening discussion. "I let that desire cloud my judgment and ignored warning signs I should have heeded." "What matters is how we respond and what we learn," I replied. 6 weeks after the board meeting, the independent investigation concluded with a comprehensive report documenting the failures and recommending structural changes. Maxwell's deception was fully exposed, but systemic weaknesses had enabled his actions. As difficult as this period was, it represented a necessary cleansing. The acquisition that might have damaged TechForge irreparably had instead forced a reckoning with flawed processes and misaligned incentives. From the ashes of this crisis, a stronger company could emerge if we learned the right lessons. The formal SEC investigation into Nexus Software began in earnest 3 months after our board meeting confrontation. Federal investigators conducted extensive interviews with TechForge executives, including 6 separate sessions with me, where I walked them through every document in my dossier. "You maintained remarkably detailed records," noted investigator Sarah Levinson during our final session. "Most people in your position wouldn't have documented things this thoroughly." When you've worked in corporate strategy, as long as I have you learn that memories conveniently shift to align with outcomes, I replied. Documentation is protection. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern that extended beyond what even I had discovered. Maxwell's relationship with Nexus wasn't merely a prior professional connection. He had actively helped them position their company for acquisition while employed at TechForge. Text messages recovered from Nexus executives' phones showed Maxwell advising them on how to present their technology to appeal specifically to Thomas's vision for the company. He had essentially been working both sides of the transaction, helping Nexus tailor their pitch while simultaneously controlling the due diligence process at TechForge. Most damning was evidence that Maxwell had received a $50,000 consulting fee from a venture capital firm with significant investment in Nexus 3 weeks before bringing the acquisition opportunity to Thomas. This payment had been concealed through a shell company registered in his brother-in-law's name. Within TechForge, I was temporarily overseeing all strategic operations, a role that became increasingly permanent as the months passed. The company needed stability and transparency after the near disaster, and my detailed knowledge of our business made me the natural choice to guide the recovery process. My first priority was rebuilding our acquisition evaluation process from the ground up. I assembled a cross-functional team including Amanda, from legal Catherine, from finance and senior representatives from technology and operations. We need a framework that prevents any single person from controlling the flow of information, I explained during our kickoff meeting. Compartmentalization nearly cost us everything. We developed a new protocol requiring independent technical assessment of all technology claims, mandatory disclosure of any personal connections to target companies, and a separate risk assessment track that reported directly to the PACE Board's Audit Committee. Thomas supported these changes publicly, though I sensed his discomfort with the implicit criticism of his previous oversight. Our working relationship had fundamentally changed. He now deferred to me on strategic matters in a way that sometimes felt like overcompensation for his previous dismissal of my concerns. The board wants us to look at potential acquisitions again, Thomas told me 4 months after the Nexus incident, but smaller targets with rock-solid technology we can verify. I've identified 3 possibilities in the data analytics space, I replied, all profitable, all with technology patents that have withstood challenges. Thomas nodded. I trust your judgment, Brigitte. Just keep me informed. The shift in our dynamic was noticed throughout the organization. Some of Maxwell's former allies resented my increased influence and the stricter controls I had implemented. Anonymous complaints appeared in our suggestion system, claiming the company had become paralyzed by process and unable to move quickly on opportunities. I addressed these concerns directly in a company town hall. Thoroughness is not the enemy of speed, I told the assembled employees. The Nexus situation didn't happen because we were too careful. It happened because we weren't careful enough in the right ways. Not everyone was convinced, but many employees who had felt sidelined or pressured under Maxwell's influence began to emerge and contribute more actively. Catherine, who had provided crucial financial evidence during the investigation, stepped into a leadership role in our corporate development team. Working with you has shown me what real mentorship looks like, she told me. After successfully leading her first acquisition assessment, Maxwell made me feel like I had to choose between my integrity and my career. You've demonstrated that the two are inseparable. 5 months after the board meeting, the SEC announced formal charges against Nexus's CEO and CTO for securities fraud, citing material misrepresentations about the company's technology and intellectual property. Maxwell wasn't named in the initial charges, but the investigation into his role continued. Thomas called me to his office after the news broke. The board is meeting next week to discuss leadership succession, he said, without preamble. Eleanor believes we need a clean break from this period. Are they asking for your resignation? I asked carefully. Not explicitly, but the suggestion is clear that my judgment has been called into question. He looked out his window at the Seattle skyline. 9 years as CEO, and this is how it ends. You built this company from $50 million to nearly $1 billion in valuation, I reminded him. One mistake, however, Significant doesn't erase that legacy. Thomas turned back to me. The board wants to know if you would consider the role of Chief Strategy Officer, reporting directly to whoever succeeds me as CEO. They believe elevating you would send the right message about our commitment to integrity in our processes. The offer was simultaneously validating and uncomfortable. I had earned this recognition through my actions, but it came at the cost of Thomas's position, a man who, despite his mistakes, had given me opportunities throughout my career. I would need to think about it, I replied honestly. My loyalty to this company includes loyalty to you, Thomas. Don't conflate the two, he said with unexpected grace. TechForge needs strong ethical leadership moving forward. I made a serious error in judgment that nearly cost us everything. The company deserves better. 2 weeks later, Thomas announced his resignation effective in 3 months to ensure a smooth transition. The board appointed Jennifer Reeves, our well-respected COO, as interim CEO, while conducting an external search for a permanent replacement. As promised, I was named Chief Strategy Officer with expanded responsibilities, including oversight of all acquisitions and strategic partnerships. In my first presentation to the board in this new role, I outlined a revised growth strategy focused on smaller, verifiable technology acquisitions rather than betting everything on a single transformative deal. This approach reduces risk while still delivering meaningful growth, I explained. And most importantly, it plays to our strengths in integration and customer expansion. Eleanor and the other board members unanimously approved the strategy. This is exactly the kind of thoughtful, realistic approach we need, Eleanor commented. Sometimes the best strategies aren't the flashiest ones. 7 months after the board meeting confrontation, we completed our first acquisition under the new protocol, a $38 million purchase of DataViz Analytics, a profitable company with patented visualization technology that complemented our existing products. The due diligence process was exhaustive but efficient, with multiple independent verifications of the technology claims and financial projections. When we announced the acquisition, analysts praised it as disciplined and strategic, a far cry from the excitement that had surrounded the proposed Nexus deal, but a solid step in rebuilding market confidence. Maxwell, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale in the industry. The SEC ultimately declined to file criminal charges, but issued a lifetime bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. His attempt to secure another position at a competing firm failed when background checks revealed the details of the Nexus affair. The final chapter of the investigation came nearly a year after that fateful board meeting. The university whose research had been appropriated by Nexus filed patent infringement suits against the company, using evidence uncovered during our due diligence and the subsequent SEC investigation. Nexus, already struggling after the failed acquisition, and regulatory penalties filed for bankruptcy protection. As I watched these developments from my new position of leadership at TechForge, I felt no satisfaction in the downfall of those who had sought to deceive us. Instead, I focused on the lessons we had learned and the stronger company we were building as a result. Thomas, in his final address to the company before departing, summed it up best. Our greatest failures can become our greatest strengths if we have the courage to learn from them honestly. TechForge is stronger today because when integrity and ambition came into conflict, we ultimately chose integrity. That choice will serve as our foundation moving forward. The acquisition that never happened had changed everything. Not just for me personally, but for the culture and future of the company I had devoted a decade of my life to building. 6 months after my promotion to Chief Strategy Officer, TechForge announced the successful completion of our acquisition of DataViz Analytics. What made this $38 million deal remarkable wasn't its size, but the thoroughness and transparency with which it had been executed. This represents the new TechForge approach to growth, Jennifer Reeves, our interim CEO, stated during the announcement. Strategic, verified, and built on a foundation of integrity at every step. The market responded positively, with our stock price increasing 12% over the following month. Analysts who had been skeptical after the Nexus debacle began publishing favorable reports about our disciplined comeback strategy. My new role gave me the authority to implement the changes I had long believed necessary. Working closely with our newly formed Ethics and Governance Committee, I developed comprehensive ethical guidelines for our corporate development activities. These included mandatory independent verification of all material technology, claims, transparent documentation of all decision-making processes, required disclosure of any personal or professional connections to acquisition targets, Chinese walls between assessment teams, to prevent groupthink, regular reporting to the board's audit committee throughout the due diligence process. We're creating a model that other companies will eventually adopt, I told my team during our quarterly strategy session, not because it's mandated, but because it produces better results. Building a new team proved both challenging and rewarding. Some executives who had thrived in the previous environment chose to leave uncomfortable with the heightened transparency and accountability. I viewed these departures as necessary for cultural transformation. Catherine Davis, who had shown such courage during the Nexus investigation, was promoted to Director of Financial Strategy. I want people who demonstrated integrity when it was difficult, not just when it was convenient, I explained, when recommending her promotion to Jennifer. I took particular satisfaction in mentoring junior employees who had been marginalized under the previous regime. Sarah Jenkins, a promising analyst who Maxwell had repeatedly sidelined, blossomed when given meaningful responsibilities. You know what the difference is, Sarah told me after successfully leading a competitive analysis project. You actually listen. When I raise concerns, you treat them as valuable input rather than obstacles. This feedback meant more to me than any formal recognition. Creating an environment where people could do their best work without compromising their integrity was perhaps my most meaningful achievement. The personal cost of the previous year had been substantial. The stress and isolation of standing alone against momentum had taken a toll on my health and relationships. During the months of investigation and transition, I had barely seen my family working 16-hour days and bringing work home on weekends. My husband James had been supportive throughout, but as things stabilized, he gently pointed out the imbalance. You saved the company, Brigitte. Now, maybe save some time for yourself and us. He was right. I had won a professional battle but neglected other equally important aspects of life. With Jennifer's encouragement, I began delegating more effectively and establishing boundaries between work and home. The company needs you at your best, Jennifer advised. That means sustainable work patterns, not perpetual crisis mode. Taking this advice to heart, I scheduled my first 2-week vacation in years, a hiking trip through national parks with my family. Disconnecting completely was terrifying at first, but by the second day, I felt a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Thomas Reynolds, our former CEO, reached out shortly after I returned. We met for coffee at a small cafe away from the office district. You look rested, he observed. Leadership suits you. It's getting easier, I admitted. How are you doing? Better than I expected, he smiled ruefully. There's a certain freedom in having your worst professional mistake behind you. Every decision seems less fraught now. Thomas had started a small consulting practice, working with early-stage startups on governance issues. I'm teaching them what not to do, based on extensive personal experience. That's valuable knowledge, I said sincerely. He nodded. The irony isn't lost on me, but I'm finding meaning in helping others avoid similar pitfalls. After a pause, he added, I never properly thanked you, Brigitte. You saved TechForge from a disaster I was blindly walking into. That took extraordinary courage. I was just doing my job, I replied. No, you were doing what was right when it would have been much easier to go along. Thomas leaned forward. Never diminish that. Integrity isn't about grand gestures. It's about making the difficult choice when everyone else is taking the easy path. His words stayed with me as TechForge continued its transformation. A year after the Nexus incident, we had completed 3 strategic acquisitions, all successful, all meticulously vetted. Our stock price had recovered, and then surpassed its previous high. The board appointed Jennifer as permanent CEO with my enthusiastic support. The final chapter in the Maxwell saga came unexpectedly. A technology journal published an investigative piece titled "The Deal That Almost Was Inside the Near Catastrophic Nexus Acquisition." The article detailed Maxwell's deception and the systemic failures that had enabled it, but also highlighted the changes TechForge had implemented afterward. The reporter had interviewed numerous industry sources, including Thomas and several board members. I had declined to participate, preferring to focus on the future rather than rehashing the past. The article's conclusion quoted an unnamed board member. "The hero of this story is the executive who refused to be silenced despite enormous pressure." In an industry often criticized for prioritizing growth over governance, she demonstrated that integrity and success aren't mutually exclusive, they're interdependent. Several colleagues sent me the article, but I didn't need external validation anymore. The real measure of our success wasn't in media coverage, but in the culture we were building daily. During a leadership retreat 18 months after the board meeting confrontation, Jennifer asked each executive to share their most important professional lesson. When my turn came, I thought carefully before responding. "I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear," I said. "It's feeling the fear of standing alone and doing what's right anyway. And I've learned that organizations don't fail or succeed because of one person's actions. They fail or succeed based on the cultural systems that either enable integrity or undermine it." "And how would you describe our culture now?" Jennifer asked. I smiled. "A work in progress, but one where speaking truth to power is valued, not punished. Where due diligence isn't an obstacle to progress, but the foundation of sustainable growth. Where we understand that how we achieve results matters as much as the results themselves." 2 years to the day after that fateful board meeting, I sat in the same conference room, now leading a strategy session with my expanded team. Catherine was presenting an acquisition opportunity she had identified and thoroughly researched. Looking around at the engaged faces, some who had been there during the crisis, others who had joined since, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. The company that had nearly made a catastrophic $225 million mistake had transformed that near disaster into a catalyst for positive change. The assistant who had mocked me was long gone, but his impact remained, not in the way he intended, but as part of a painful lesson that had ultimately made both me and TechForge stronger. As Catherine concluded her well-researched presentation, I recognized that my greatest professional achievement wasn't preventing a bad acquisition or earning a C-suite title. It was helping to build an organization where ethical decision-making wasn't exceptional, but expected, where speaking up was encouraged rather than punished, and where integrity served as the foundation for sustainable success. Have you ever had to stand alone against pressure to compromise your principles? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. This journey taught me that sometimes the hardest professional moments lead to the most meaningful growth. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to see more stories of overcoming workplace challenges. Remember, in business and in life, integrity isn't just about being morally right. It's about creating sustainable success. Thank you for watching, and may you find the courage to stand firm when your moment of truth arrives.